August 28, 1856, Charleston, South Carolina, the night of the Great Carolina Hurricane. The Rutledge plantation groaned under lantern light and wind. Inside, Margaret cradled her child. Outside, Sarah rocked the cradle that would end 2 lives before dawn. The storm pressed against the windows like judgment itself, rattling the glass panes of the grand house where cotton money had built marble floors over blood-soaked soil. In the nursery, Margaret Rutledge sang hymns to her 3-month-old son, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. She had no idea that 20 feet away, Sarah Whitmore stood in the shadows, iron rocker bar cold in her trembling hands. Sarah had built that cradle with her own calloused fingers. Mahogany wood and wrought iron, crafted for the child she was forced to love more than her own flesh. The same hands that carved those smooth rails had once held her own baby boy, felt his final breath slip away while she was forbidden to leave Margaret's side. The mistress had laughed that day, saying Sarah was a mother to white children, never her own. Lightning split the sky. Sarah remembered the weight of her son's body, how small he felt in the grave she dug alone behind the tobacco barn. She remembered Margaret's milk-drunk smile as she watched Sarah nurse the heir to the Rutledge fortune. She remembered the taste of her own tears, swallowed in silence. The hurricane's howl grew louder, drowning out Margaret's lullaby. Sarah stepped forward, the cradle's iron bar gleaming like divine retribution in the candlelight. The same hands that had rocked this child to sleep would now rock him into eternity. Margaret looked up just as Sarah raised the weapon. "What are you—" The words died in her throat. Sarah's eyes held no hatred, only the terrible calm of justice finally arriving. She had nursed this child with milk meant for her own son. She had sung him to sleep while her own baby lay cold in the earth. Tonight the storm would wash away more than just the plantation's sins. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you from and what time is it there? Don't forget to subscribe. The cradle rocked once. Sarah's grip tightened on the iron bar. Outside, the hurricane screamed like all the mothers who had lost their children to this house of horrors. Inside, Margaret clutched her baby closer, finally understanding that some debts can only be paid in blood. Sarah struck swift and sure. The iron bar came down like thunder, silencing the infant's cry forever. Margaret's scream joined the storm's fury as Sarah turned toward her, the weapon dripping in the candlelight. "You made me a mother to your child," Sarah whispered, her voice steady as stone. "Now let me show you what a real mother's love looks like." The second blow ended Margaret's hymns forever. The storm surge broke through the windows as if summoned by Sarah's vengeance, flooding the nursery where 2 bodies lay still. Sarah walked through the rising water, leaving the cradle to float like a coffin in the dark. This is the true story of Sarah Whitmore, who turned a cradle into a weapon and a storm into judgment. While they prayed for the storm to spare their mansion, Sarah remembered the night they took her child. Charleston glowed that Christmas Eve like a jewel box, gas lamps flickering in frost-kissed windows, carriages rolling over cobblestones slick with winter rain. The Rutledge mansion stood proud on Meeting Street, its columns wrapped in holly and imported silk ribbons. Inside, crystal glasses clinked with French champagne, while Margaret Rutledge played hostess to Charleston's finest families, her newborn son sleeping peacefully in his nursery upstairs. But 20 miles south at the plantation, the slave quarters sagged under December's bitter wind. Rotting planks leaked rain onto dirt floors where Sarah Whitmore lay on a cornhusk mattress, her empty arms aching with phantom weight. The same moon that blessed Charleston's Christmas revelry cast cold light through gaps in her cabin walls, illuminating the damp stain where her milk had soaked through her rough cotton dress. 3 months earlier, Sarah had given birth in this same cabin while Margaret labored in the big house. 2 babies born on the same night, one white, one black, both crying for their mother's milk. But only one would live to see winter. The memory played behind Sarah's closed eyelids like a fever dream. Margaret's screams echoing from the master bedroom while Sarah bit down on a leather strap, delivering her son alone on the cabin floor. The midwife, a bent old woman named Nessa, had cut both cords with the same blade, as if marking some twisted destiny. 2 babies, same breath, Nessa had whispered, wrapping Sarah's son in a flour sack. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but the Lord, it seemed, worked through the mistress's commands. The very next morning, Margaret had summoned Sarah to the big house. The new mother lay propped against silk pillows, her face pale but triumphant, holding her red-faced infant like a prize. She looked at Sarah's milk-heavy breasts and smiled with the satisfaction of ownership. "You'll nurse him," Margaret announced, not asking. "My milk hasn't come in properly, and I won't have my son suffer for it. Your boy can make do with goat's milk and cornmeal mush." Sarah's voice had been steady as still water. "Ma'am, my baby needs—" "Your baby needs whatever I say he needs." Margaret's tone turned sharp as winter wind. "You're a wet nurse now, Sarah. That's your purpose. My son drinks first, always first." So began the slow murder of Sarah's child. Every morning, Sarah would walk the dirt path from quarters to mansion, her breasts heavy with milk meant for her own flesh and blood. She would sit in Margaret's sunny parlor, feeding the white baby while her own grew thinner in the cabin. The mistress would watch with proprietary pride, commenting on how well her son was thriving. "Look how he grows, Sarah. You have good milk, rich milk. It's almost like you were born for this." By July, Sarah's baby was barely breathing. His ribs showed through paper-thin skin, his cry no more than a whisper. Sarah begged to feed him, to give him even the smallest taste of what was rightfully his. But Margaret's answer never changed. "My son first, always first. That's the natural order, the natural order." Sarah would remember those words on the night she broke it forever. Her baby died on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun set over the rice fields. Sarah held his tiny body against her chest, feeling his heart flutter and stop like a trapped bird. She had been nursing Margaret's son that very afternoon, watching him grow fat and pink while her own child withered in the quarters. She buried him alone behind the slave cemetery, in ground so hard she had to use a kitchen knife to break the earth. No prayers, no hymns, just a mother's tears falling on a flour sack shroud. The moon watched through the cypress trees, its face as cold and distant as God himself. The next morning, Margaret found her in the nursery, mechanically feeding the white baby with tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong with you?" Margaret demanded. "You look like death itself." "My baby died, ma'am." Margaret paused, processing this information like a minor inconvenience. Then she laughed, a sound like silver bells over broken glass. "Well, that's for the best, isn't it? One less mouth to feed. Besides, you were meant to be a mother to white children, Sarah, not your own. This is God's plan for you." Something snapped inside Sarah's chest, not her heart. That had already broken. Something deeper, something that could never be repaired. "God's plan," Sarah repeated, her voice hollow as a bell. "Exactly. You understand your place now. You're my son's nurse, not a mother in your own right." "That was just biology, Sarah. This is purpose." Sarah continued feeding Margaret's baby, but her eyes had stopped blinking. The hurricane building in the Atlantic had nothing on the storm gathering behind her quiet gaze. For months, she played the perfect wet nurse. She fed Margaret's son while her own body ached with emptiness. She sang him lullabies while her voice cracked with grief. She rocked his cradle while remembering the weight of her own dead child. The cradle she had built with her own hands, carved from plantation wood and fitted with iron rockers. The cradle that was supposed to hold her baby, not Margaret's. the cradle that had become a monument to stolen motherhood. On August 28th, as the Great Carolina hurricane bore down on Charleston, Sarah sat in the nursery watching Margaret feed her son imported pears while the slave quarters flooded in the storm. Rain leaked through the quarter's rotting roof while the mansion's windows glowed with lamplight. Her people huddled in the dark while Margaret's family feasted on roasted goose and French wine. She stared at the fire but saw only the tiny grave she had dug, and then she stopped being human. Sarah gripped the cradle's iron rocker bar. Swing, breathe, count the waves. The hurricane was still 2 days out when Sarah began her preparations, moving through the Rutledge mansion like a ghost, learning to haunt. She memorized every creak in the floorboards, the loose plank by the nursery door that groaned under weight, the smooth spot near Margaret's bedroom where generations of house slaves had worn the wood to silence. She counted steps, 17 from the kitchen to the nursery, 23 from her quarters to the back door, each number a prayer in reverse. During the day, she performed her duties with mechanical precision. Feed the baby, rock the cradle, sing the lullabies Margaret demanded, Jesus loves the little children, and Rock of Ages, while the irony burned her throat like swallowed glass. But at night, when the house settled into Charleston's humid darkness, Sarah would slip the iron rocker bar from beneath her sleeping rags and practice her movements. Swing. Breathe. The bar was 18 inches of wrought iron, forged by the plantation blacksmith who had died the winter before. Sarah had specified the weight herself when she commissioned the cradle, wanting something solid enough to last generations. She never imagined those generations would end in a single night. Margaret Rutledge moved through her days wrapped in silk and sanctimony, a woman who believed her piety justified her cruelty. She attended Charleston's First Presbyterian Church every Sunday, her prayer book bound in Morocco leather, her voice rising sweet and clear during the hymns. She organized charity drives for Charleston's poor white families while her own slaves slept on dirt floors. She read scripture aloud during breakfast. Her favorite passage from Ephesians, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. You see, Sarah?" Margaret would say, looking up from her gold-edged Bible. God himself ordained this arrangement. Your servitude is divine will. Sarah would nod and continue spooning porridge into the baby's mouth, each bite a small betrayal of her own dead child. But inside she was counting. 1 spoonful for the mockery, 2 for the stolen milk, 3 for the grave she dug alone. Margaret's husband, Thomas Rutledge, was a shadow man who profited from other people's suffering. He spent his days at Charleston's slave market on Chalmers Street, his nights at gentlemen's clubs discussing cotton futures and human chattel like they were the same commodity. When he was home, he barely acknowledged Sarah's existence, seeing her as furniture that happened to feed his son. But Sarah watched him too. She learned his patterns, his absences, his weaknesses. Thomas would be gone during the storm, safe in Charleston's exchange building with the other merchants, while the plantation faced nature's wrath alone. Convenient for a man who had never faced consequences for his crimes. The baby, little Charles Rutledge, was 3 months old and fat with Sarah's stolen milk. He had his mother's pale blue eyes and his father's cruel mouth, already learning to cry with the imperious demand of someone who expected the world to bend to his will. Sarah fed him dutifully, but she no longer saw a child when she looked at him. She saw the future. Another generation of Rutledges built on broken black bodies. Another master who would grow up believing human beings were property. Some nights, she would hold him and remember her own son's weight. How different it felt to cradle life you had chosen to create versus life you were forced to sustain. Her boy had been gentle, even dying, his last breath a whisper, not a scream. This baby shrieked his demands like a tiny tyrant. red-faced and furious whenever his needs weren't met immediately. "You're spoiling him," Margaret would say when Sarah responded too quickly to his cries. "A baby must learn discipline early. Let him cry. It strengthens the lungs." But when her own son cried, Margaret's maternal instincts overrode her philosophy. She would snatch him from Sarah's arms, crooning and kissing his forehead, whispering promises of inheritance and power. The plantation would be his. The slaves would be his. The cycle would continue, unbroken. Not if Sarah had anything to say about it. She began testing the iron bar's weight during her evening chores, hiding the motion within the rhythm of her work. Lifting it felt like hefting justice itself, heavy, purposeful, inevitable. She practiced her swing while hanging laundry, the motion disguised as shaking out wet sheets. She calculated angles while dusting furniture, imagining trajectories and impact points. The cradle sat in the nursery like an altar to stolen motherhood. Sarah had carved every detail herself. The smooth curves of the rockers, the intricate spindles that filtered lamplight into patterns on the walls. She had sanded it with her own hands until it was smooth as silk, imagining her son sleeping peacefully within its embrace. Instead, it held Margaret's child, the boy who had thrived while her own baby withered. Each night, Sarah would remove one of the iron rocker bars, testing its balance and heft. The cradle would still rock on the remaining bar, but less smoothly, with a slight wobble that only she noticed. Margaret saw only what she expected to see, a dutiful slave tending to her precious heir. The lullabies became Sarah's countdown. "Rock-a-bye, baby," in the treetop, she would sing while testing her grip. "When the wind blows, the cradle will rock," she would practice her swing. "When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall," she would imagine the iron bar connecting with flesh and bone. "And down will come baby, cradle and all," she would see justice finally served. Margaret loved those lullabies, never understanding that each verse was a promise of death. She would request them specifically, settling into her rocking chair with needlework while Sarah sang and plodded. Sometimes she would hum along, her voice harmonizing with Sarah's in a twisted duet of predator and prey. "You have such a soothing voice, Sarah," Margaret would say. "My Charles sleeps so peacefully when you sing. It's like you were born to comfort white children. Born to comfort white children while her own died uncomforted. Born to sing lullabies to other mothers' babies while her own grave grew weeds in silence. Born to serve until death, or until she chose to serve death instead." The hurricane's approach was announced by seabirds fleeing inland and a pressure drop that made everyone's bones ache. Charleston's harbor began to churn with whitecaps, and the rice fields flooded with brackish water. Margaret fretted about her garden, her imported roses and French lilacs that might not survive the storm. Sarah fretted about nothing. She was past worry, beyond fear. She had entered that strange calm that comes when a person finally accepts what they must do. Her movements became fluid, purposeful. Her face relaxed into the mask of perfect servitude that had protected her for 28 years. But behind that mask, something else was growing. Not rage. Rage was too hot, too chaotic for what she planned. This was colder, more focused. This was judgment condensed into human form, divine retribution wearing Sarah's face. On the night before the storm, she removed the iron rocker bar one final time and held it up to the candlelight. The metal gleamed dull silver, pitted with age but still strong, still capable of ending lives that should never have begun. Margaret's voice drifted from the parlor, reading scripture aloud to her infant son. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul." Sarah smiled for the first time in months. Tomorrow Margaret would meet her shepherd face to face. It was just a cradle once. Tonight it was justice, iron reborn. At midnight, as shutters tore from windows, Sarah lifted the cradle's iron bar. The storm sang louder than hymns. The great Carolina hurricane arrived like divine wrath made manifest. Wind screaming at 100 miles per hour. Rain slashing sideways through the darkness. Waves from Charleston harbor crashing inland with the fury of an ocean gone mad. The Rutledge mansion groaned under nature's assault, its marble columns trembling, its crystal chandeliers swaying like hanged men in the howling darkness. Sarah moved through the chaos with supernatural calm. While other slaves huddled in the quarters, praying to survive the night, she walked the mansion's halls with purpose carved from grief. The iron rocker bar felt weightless in her hands. Not because it was light, but because her dead son's memory made everything else insignificant. Thunder crashed overhead like God's own hammer. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Sarah's face through the nursery window. Features carved from stone, eyes reflecting nothing but determination. She had waited 3 months for this moment. 3 months of forced smiles and stolen milk. 3 months of singing lullabies to the child who had thrived while her own baby starved. The nursery glowed with candlelight despite the storm's fury. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, clutching little Charles against her breast, whispering prayers that would go unanswered. She looked up as Sarah entered, rain dripping from her rough cotton dress onto the Persian carpet. "Sarah, thank God you're here. The storm, it's worse than anything I've ever seen. Help me move Charles to the interior room." Sarah closed the nursery door behind her. The soft click was lost in the wind's howl, but it sounded like a coffin lid to her ears. She stepped closer, the iron bar hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice steady as still water. "Do you remember what you told me the day my baby died?" Margaret blinked, confused by the question. Lightning flashed again, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. The baby stirred in her arms, making soft suckling sounds that once would have broken Sarah's heart. Now they only strengthened her resolve. "Sarah, this isn't the time for... You said I was meant to be a mother to white children. Not my own. That it was God's plan." The wind picked up, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers. Margaret's face went pale as she began to understand the look in Sarah's eyes. Not the deferential gaze of a servant, but the steady stare of judgment incarnate. "Sarah, you're frightening me. Put down whatever you're holding and help me with..." His name was Samuel. Sarah's voice cut through the storm like a blade. "My son, you never asked his name, but it was Samuel. He would have been 4 months old today." The iron bar emerged from her skirt like a sword being drawn. Margaret's scream joined the hurricane's fury as Sarah raised the weapon above her head. The candlelight caught its surface, making it gleam like divine retribution. "You fed him goat's milk while I nursed your boy. You let him waste away while Charles grew fat on what should have been Samuel's." Sarah's words fell like hammer blows. "You mocked my grief, called it God's plan." Margaret scrambled backward, still clutching the baby. "Sarah, please. He's just a child. An innocent..." So was Samuel. The first blow came down swift and sure. The iron bar connected with little Charles's skull with a sound like an egg cracking. Soft, wet, final. His cry cut off mid-breath, replaced by the terrible silence that only death brings. Margaret's scream shattered the air, raw and primal, a sound no hymn could contain. Sarah felt nothing. No satisfaction, no horror, no regret. Just the weight of balance finally restored. One dead child for another. The mathematics of justice. Margaret lunged for the door, but Sarah was faster. 3 months of careful observation had taught her every inch of this room. She caught Margaret by the hair, yanking her back toward the center of the nursery. The mistress fell hard, Charles's lifeless body tumbling from her arms onto the Persian carpet, where his blood began to pool like spilled wine. "My milk." Sarah whispered, standing over Margaret's cowering form. "My body, my child's birthright. You stole it all." Margaret tried to crawl toward the door, her silk nightgown tangling around her legs. "Please, Sarah, I'll free you. I'll give you papers. You'll give me nothing. You have nothing left to give." The second blow caught Margaret in the temple as she tried to rise. Her head snapped sideways with a crack that echoed over the storm's roar. She collapsed beside her dead son, blood mixing with his on the expensive carpet. Red ink on an overdue page, payment finally rendered. But Margaret wasn't finished. She rolled onto her back, gasping, her blue eyes wide with shock and pain. Blood trickled from her ear, staining her golden hair dark as mud. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I gave you purpose. I gave you meaning." Sarah knelt beside her mistress, the iron bar resting across her knees like a ceremonial scepter. For a moment she saw Margaret not as the monster who had destroyed her life, but as what she truly was. A broken woman clinging to a system that had poisoned her soul as surely as it had crushed others. "You gave me nothing," Sarah said softly. "You only took, and tonight the debt comes due." The third blow ended Margaret's questions forever. Outside, the hurricane's eye wall hit the plantation like the fist of an angry god. Windows exploded inward, sending glass shards spinning through the air like deadly snow. The mansion's roof began to buckle, timbers groaning under the impossible pressure. Rain poured through the broken windows, turning the nursery floor into a shallow lake where two bodies floated like discarded dolls. Sarah stood in the chaos, untouched by the destruction around her. The iron bar had grown warm in her hands, as if heated by the fire of her vengeance. She looked down at Margaret's still form and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. The storm surge arrived with a sound like the world ending. Water rushed through the mansion's lower floors, carrying furniture and memories in its churning embrace. Sarah heard screams from the slave quarters, her people fighting for their lives while she had chosen to take life instead. She moved through the flooding house like a sleepwalker, the iron bar still clutched in her fist. In the hallway she found young Lila, a 12-year-old house slave, trapped beneath a fallen beam. The girl's dark eyes were wide with terror, her thin body pinned by timber too heavy for her to move. For a moment Sarah hesitated. She had spent all her humanity on revenge. What was left for mercy? But Samuel's memory spoke to her in that moment. Not the emaciated child who had died in her arms, but the baby she had imagined he might become. Gentle, kind, someone who would have helped others even when he had nothing left to give. Sarah dropped the iron bar and threw her weight against the beam. Her muscles screamed with effort, but she managed to shift it enough for Lila to crawl free. The girl looked up at her with grateful tears, not understanding that she had just been saved by a killer. "Run," Sarah whispered. "Get to high ground. Tell them Sarah Whitmore says run." Lila nodded and splashed away through the rising water, disappearing into the storm-torn night. Sarah watched her go, then retrieved the iron bar from where it had fallen. The metal was cold again, ordinary once more. Its purpose was complete. The mansion continued to collapse around her. Chandeliers crashed to the floor, their crystal teardrops scattering like broken dreams. Family portraits fell from their frames, their painted faces drowning in the flood. The entire Rutledge legacy was washing away with the tide. Slavery's monument reduced to floating debris. Sarah made her way back to the nursery, where the cradle still rocked gently in the rising water. Empty now, purposeless. She had built it with love, filled it with someone else's child, and turned it into an instrument of justice. Now it was just wood and iron again, waiting for the storm to claim it. The bodies of Margaret and Charles bobbed in the flood like accusations she no longer needed to answer. Their blood had mixed with the brackish water, diluting their sins into the ocean that would carry them away. No graves, no monuments, no legacy, except the justice Sarah had carved from their bones. Thunder rolled overhead, but the worst of the storm was passing. The hurricane's eye moved inland, taking its fury with it. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a changed world, one where the Rutledge plantation was just wreckage, where little Charles would never grow up to own human beings, where Margaret's cruelty had been answered in kind. Sarah walked through the flooded mansion one last time, her bare feet splashing through water that carried away the remnants of her bondage. The iron bar felt heavier now, weighted with memory and purpose fulfilled. She would keep it, not as a weapon, but as a reminder, proof that even the powerless could become the instrument of their own justice. In the great hall, she found a chair that hadn't been claimed by the flood. She sat down slowly like an old woman despite her 28 years. The iron bar lay across her knees, dripping water and darker things onto her soaked dress. Behind her, the cradle drifted past like a ghost ship, carrying no one toward nowhere. The storm was ending, but Sarah's story was just beginning. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, become something she had never intended to be. But for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt truly free. She sat in the flooded hall, iron bar across her knees, cradle drifting empty behind her. Morning came. Sarah did not run. She waited for justice, knowing she had already served it. Dawn broke over the devastated plantation like God's own reckoning. Pale gold light filtering through storm clouds that still churned with the memory of violence. The Great Carolina hurricane had moved inland, leaving behind a landscape transformed by water and wind. Ancient live oaks lay uprooted, their Spanish moss trailing in flood pools like burial shrouds. The rice fields had become lakes, reflecting the sky like mirrors broken by floating debris. Sarah remained in the mansion's great hall, seated on her water-stained chair with the iron rocker bar across her knees. She had not moved since the storm's passing, watching the sun rise through windows stripped of their glass. Around her, the Rutledge legacy floated in ruins, furniture reduced to kindling, portraits dissolved to canvas scraps, the symbols of wealth and power rendered meaningless by nature's indifference. The surviving slaves found her there at first light. They had emerged from the quarters like resurrection itself, battered but breathing, their shacks destroyed but their spirits somehow intact. They stood in the doorway, afraid to enter, afraid to speak. They had heard rumors in the wind, whispers that quiet Sarah had done something terrible and wonderful in the night. Young Lila stepped forward first, the child Sarah had saved from the fallen beam. Her dark eyes met Sarah's with understanding beyond her 12 years. "Miss Sarah," she whispered. "What you done?" Sarah's voice was calm as still water. "What needed doing?" They found Margaret's body in the nursery, her golden hair spread like seaweed in the brackish flood. Little Charles floated beside her, his cherubic face peaceful in death. The cradle rocked empty nearby, its remaining rocker bar creaking a funeral dirge in the morning breeze. The other plantations sent riders when the storm cleared. Charleston's authorities arrived by afternoon, men in brass buttons and moral certainty, who had never questioned a system that fed their children with other mothers' milk. They found Sarah exactly where the slaves had left her, unmoved and unrepentant. "Sarah Whitmore," announced Sheriff Hawthorne, a thin man whose grandfather had owned her grandfather. "You are under arrest for the murders of Margaret Rutledge and her infant son." Sarah rose slowly, the iron bar clattering to the floor. "I am under arrest for being human." They shackled her with chains that had held her people for centuries, but she walked between her captors like a queen processing to her coronation. The surviving slaves watched from the ruins, their faces carved with grief and pride. They began to sing as the wagon pulled away, not hymns of submission, but work songs transformed into anthems of defiance. The trial lasted 3 days in Charleston's courthouse, a building constructed with slave labor and funded by slave profits. Sarah sat in the defendant's chair with her back straight, her eyes fixed on something beyond the courtroom walls. She spoke only when asked direct questions, her answers sharp as broken glass. "Did you kill Margaret Rutledge?" "I ended her." "Did you kill the infant Charles Rutledge?" "I prevented him from becoming his mother." "Do you feel remorse for these heinous acts?" Sarah's voice rang clear as church bells. "I feel remorse for the 28 years it took me to remember I was human." The prosecution painted her as a monster, a savage who had betrayed Christian kindness with bestial violence. The defense, appointed by the court and paid by the state, argued diminished capacity, claiming the storm had driven her mad. Sarah listened to both sides reduce her to something less than human and smiled for the second time in months. When asked to speak before sentencing, Sarah stood and faced the gallery. White faces stared back at her with fascination and horror, hungry for a confession or plea that would confirm their worldview. Instead, she gave them truth. "You call me monster, but I was made in your image. You call me savage, but I learned savagery in your schools. You stole my child's milk to feed your heir, then mocked me for grieving what you destroyed. I was a mother before I was your property. I was human before you decided otherwise. And in the end, I chose to be human again." The judge, a man who owned 17 people and called it Christian stewardship, sentenced her to hang at dawn. Sarah nodded as if he had offered her freedom. She spent her last night in Charleston jail, a stone building that had held rebels and runaways for generations. Through her cell window, she could see the harbor where slave ships had once anchored, where her ancestors had arrived in chains, where her story had begun long before she was born. Other enslaved women came to see her in those final hours. They brought wildflowers and whispered songs, pressing their faces to the bars like pilgrims at a shrine. They knew she would die, but they also knew something else. She had shown them it was possible to choose their own ending. At dawn, Sarah walked to the gallows with her head high. The crowd that gathered was larger than anyone expected. White faces hungry for spectacle, black faces carved with sorrow and something deeper. She climbed the 13 steps without assistance, her bare feet silent on the wooden planks. The executioner asked if she had final words. Sarah looked out over the crowd, past the courthouse, toward the plantation, where her son lay buried in unmarked earth. "My name is Sarah Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying over the morning air. "I was Samuel's mother first. Remember that when you forget everything else." The rope was rough against her neck, but she did not close her eyes. She watched the sun rise over Charleston harbor one last time, thinking of her boy, thinking of the cradle that had become an instrument of justice, thinking of the storm that had washed away everything except the truth. They buried her in Potter's Field without a marker, thinking death would silence her story. They were wrong. Within a week, enslaved mothers across the Carolina coast were humming a new lullaby, one that spoke of a woman who chose justice over survival, who turned sorrow into strength, who made the powerful pay for their sins. They called it Sarah's Song, and they sang it softly in the quarters when the overseers weren't listening. The cradle survived the hurricane, washing up on Folly Beach 3 days after Sarah's execution. Someone carved her name into its waterlogged wood before it disappeared again, claimed by families who understood its significance. Sarah's cradle became a whispered legend, a symbol of maternal love corrupted and redeemed. Where the Rutledge mansion once stood, oleander bushes grew wild and poisonous, their pink flowers blooming each August like memorial wreaths. Local enslaved people said the plants were Sarah's tears, transformed by the earth into something beautiful and deadly. Children were warned not to pick the flowers, but mothers would point to them and whisper stories when the masters weren't watching. The hurricane that destroyed the plantation became known as Sarah's storm in the oral histories passed down through generations. Meteorologists would later classify it as a Category 4 hurricane, but to the people who lived through it, it was something more. Divine justice wearing wind and rain, a mother's grief given form and fury. Thomas Rutledge returned from Charleston to find his world destroyed. His wife and heir were dead, his house was ruins, his fortune was scattered across the tidal flats. He tried to rebuild, but storms seemed to follow him. 3 more hurricanes hit the coast in the next 5 years, each one destroying whatever progress he made. By 1862, he had fled to Virginia, leaving the land to grow wild with oleander and memory. Today, if you visit Folly Beach at dawn, you might see mothers walking the shoreline with their children, pointing to the horizon where Sarah's plantation once stood. They tell the old stories in new words, keeping her name alive like a lighthouse beacon cutting through historical darkness. The city of Charleston erected no monument to Sarah Whitmore. Her grave remains unmarked, her story absent from official histories. But in the Gullah communities of the Carolina coast, grandmothers still rock their babies to sleep with lullabies that remember a woman who chose humanity over survival, who turned a storm into judgment, who proved that even the powerless could reshape their own endings. This is Sarah Whitmore. They tried to bury her name in water, but it rose like a song. Subscribe, share, remember.